Today's agenda, all three IOUs will be presenting their updated plans for integrated planning. We will start off with SDG&E and followed by SEE and PG&E. They will present for about 30 to 35 minutes each, and we'll have a 20-minute Q&A after. And afterwards, we will have an open discussion and next steps and wrap up. Please note that depending on the discussions, we may finish at 12:30, but if there's more discussion going on, we can have lunch at 12:30 to 1:30 and then reconvene at 1:30 for another 30-minute discussion and wrap up. Workshop number 2, objectives. We want to learn about the IOU's updated integrated planning proposals. The IOUs will address stakeholder questions from the first workshop and to obtain additional feedback for further adjustments to help them refine their proposals for the Tier 3 advice letter due on December 15, 2025. Just a recap on integrated planning and why we're doing this. Integrated planning will explore how the IOUs can bundle upgrades for distribution infrastructure with other distribution work streams, such as wildfire safety, usually undergrounding. And the primary goal is to save costs by avoiding working on the same asset twice. So instead of them working on undergrounding now and then capacity upgrade in the future, they can both do them at the same time. There are others proceeding affected from this integrated planning, such as the ones in the Safety Policy Division, the risk-based decision-making framework, which is used for the wildfire safety, and it requires the IOUs to identify and also use cost-benefit analysis for their projects. The general rate case would also be affected because ultimately projects that result from integrated planning will eventually go through the GRC process for cost recovery. Please note that integrated planning is in the high DER proceeding and we will not make any changes outside of this proceeding. By that I mean we will not make changes to the RDF. I have here just a quick background recap. This is integrated plan is from the decision 24-10-030. It requires 2 workshops, and this is the second workshop. Ordering paragraph 17 will require a Tier 3 advice letter, and this is for the IOUs to propose a method to calculate and consider whether the increased project cost from increased sizing would be less than or equal to the risk-adjusted benefit from avoiding future projects. The advice letter would also tackle questions, such as how could it maintain the flexibility of the distribution process, how would it estimate increased costs for current projects, and how the RDF framework and benefit ratio data plays into the integrated planning. There will be topics discussing cost effectiveness and cost efficiency, risk and potential risk reduction, and how they would estimate the cost of future capacity projects, and how do they address projects planned in the high fire strips. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to SDG&E. I'm also reading in the chat that the raise hand feature is not working, so I will work on that one while Santiago is presenting.
Fixed it, John.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And 1-2 has already raised their hand.
Okay. Yes, when?
Hey, thanks, John. Could you go back 2 slides to the slide covering paragraph 16 and 17? So just to make sure that we have the right interpretation here. So order paragraph 16 talks about workshops with proposals on integrated planning, right? And then, but order paragraph 17 and the questions within order paragraph 17, those don't. There is no reference to integrated planning. It talks about what's in bold, which is a methodology to consider increased project costs for increased sizing of any related assets, and such. And so when you guys, when order paragraph 16 was written, and when you guys have integrated planning, is integrated planning defined as the context to order in paragraph 17? How do you guys define integrated planning?
Integrated planning during the discussion during staff proposal is I guess the main goal of this one is that we have capacity upgrades that are like in the further out in the future, like year 5 or longer, that is not very certain, and we're trying to electrify and not fall behind, and from the IPER, which is a couple of years behind on their data. So we have this challenge of determining how much we really need to upgrade, but we don't want to over upgrade, but also we don't want to fall behind. So integrated planning is looking into possibility where if there's a high chance of those potential capacity needs in the future that may be needed, but if it's significantly cheaper or again like cost effective to upgrade now, then we could consider doing the upgrade now instead of waiting for the next 5 years or longer to determine that we need those projects.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's really helpful. So what I heard there is that integrated planning in ordering paragraph 16 is really essentially referring to the definition of the proposed methods to calculate and consider whether increased project costs and increased sizing of any related assets are less than or equal to the risk-adjusted benefits of avoiding future projects to upgrade grid capacity. So there's integrated planning in ordering paragraph 16 actually points to the definition within 17. Is that correct?
I would say so, yes, because these workshops are meant to like provide us information like what the IOUs are presenting, and also give you feedback or have comments from stakeholders to kind of like just like really we're trying to determine okay what's really integrated planning, where it's a new concept for us, and that's what we're trying to figure out through these workshops.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. That was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, San Diego, you're up.
Just to test, can you hear me right, John?
Yes.
Okay, great. Welcome, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining SDG's Integrated Grid Planning Workshop number 2. My name is Shuang Xie, Senior Engineer with SDG&E Distribution Planning Policy. For completeness and clarification of this workshop, we kindly ask that the questions would be reserved for the Q&A session designated at the conclusion of the presentation. So in case if there's urgent matter arises during the session, please submit your question via the chat function. At the beginning of the workshop, we'll do a little recap of workshop 1. Workshop 1 was held on October 10th, 2025 among the joint IOUs. During the first workshop at DG&E, we presented an overview of our integrated planning approach. We emphasized how distribution planning results are integrated in our core business processes and it's coordinated across different work streams, such as distribution planning, wildfire mitigation, and reliability projects. This second workshop is structured, as John introduced, in accordance with OP 16 requirements. And for SDG's presentation, it comprises two parts. The first part will present SDG's proposed approach for integrated grid planning in response to OP 17. We will outline how SDG's framework supports efficient and coordinated planning. For the second part, we'll address stakeholder comments by major group of stakeholder questions raised by ED and stakeholders following workshop 1. With that, I'll hand over to my colleague Jan Stack to walk through SDG's IGP approach and response to comments.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chuang. Yeah, I'm Jan Strack, and I work in the distribution planning area. We're going to go through our proposal, and then we're going to go, as Chuang said, we're going to address some of the comments and questions that came up. I'm looking at myself on camera here for the first time in a long time. Looks like I have not improved the makeup, so I need to do a little better with the makeup next time. So let's see here. First of all, let me just say at the outset that what you're going to hear today is not too dissimilar from what E presented at the last workshop. We have not changed the proposal. What we are proposing is to use our existing planning process because it effectively fulfills the goals of the integrated planning process. And just in fairly general terms, we achieved that through a coordinated planning exercise among the various business units at SDG that are involved with distribution upgrade activities. So our various processes identify upgrades that, for purposes of today, accommodate customer load growth, and that's what we do in the distribution planning process. And then we also have business units that provide wildfire safety and power shutoff. I'll get the right name here, public safety power shutoffs. And there's business units that are involved in reliability, such as aging asset replacement. So these various processes can potentially result in overlaps between identified upgrades. And while we think these overlaps are going to be unlikely, and I'm going to speak a little bit more to that in a moment, but while we think they're unlikely, should they occur, our existing processes do consider, and if necessary, and again, I don't think this is going to happen very often, but if necessary, calculate whether the cost of building an upcycling asset sooner would be less than or equal to the benefit of avoiding upgrade later. And I use the word upcycling here, but we had a lot of internal discussions about this and amongst the other utilities, but you're going to hear more about this later from the other utilities as well. But I think upsizing is probably a misnomer. It's probably not the best word that we should be using because as it turns out, we have a fairly rigorous set of standards that we plan to. Those design standards essentially determine for any particular need what kind of asset we need to add. And so what we're really talking about with integrated planning is what's the appropriate timing of those assets. So when you have an overlap, what's the sensible decision that you're going to reach to meet both set of needs, both the needs in, say, the wildfire area and the needs in the distribution planning customer load growth area? What's the proper timing for that asset? The asset sizes are pretty much already known because we have a standard. So in any way, we use upsizing as a convenient term. The commission uses that term in the decision. Nevertheless, I think it's a little bit misnomer because we're not really through the IGP determining what the size of the asset should be. we're really just determining what's the appropriate timing of those assets to meet the needs of the various needs of the distribution system. Okay, and I think just to underscore that, I think what you're going to hear again from the other utilities again is that what this really boils down to is good engineering practice. It's the engineering that's going to determine the best solutions. It's rare that I think it's going to be a cost consideration, because I think in most cases it'll be obvious what the right, from a cost perspective, what the right solution is. And I have a very simple example I'll go through to kind of make that point, but we'll get to that. Okay, next slide. So with that said, let's just go right to the questions. I think John flashed them up earlier. There were 6 questions. The first one had to do about the flexibility of the planning process. Since we're not proposing any changes to the existing planning process, you know, we don't really see that there's any impact on our flexibility to do different things in planning as we need to, nor does it change the ability for us to improve over time. So again, the IGP itself doesn't impede the flexibility of the planning process in our case. Similarly with the cost estimation practices, again, IGP doesn't change the cost estimation practices. As I mentioned, we rely heavily on standards to determine what's needed. And the cost wouldn't be changed by the integrated planning process. And just a note here that wildfire safety type projects, things that go through the ramp process, they're subject to risk-based decision-making framework. Nothing changes there either. They're still subject to the benefit cost analysis as required by the commission orders. And by the way, I have an expert here on ramp in case something comes up on ramp. Joaquin has joined us here in the room, and he can answer any specific questions. Although I don't think this is about ramp per se. This is more about what you do when there's an overlap. But in case there is, Joaquin is here. Question 3 was about the cost effectiveness and cost efficiencies. As I noted, if it's not obvious what the right solution is when there's an overlap, and we have to do some cost analysis, we would just apply our standard engineering economics to determine what the most economical solution would be. But in most cases, I think it's going to be obvious. Okay, next slide. Question 4 in OP 17 asked about risk reduction. And again, the wildfire mitigation and public safety power shutoffs, they mitigate specific risks that are identified and discussed in the ramp filings. And upgrades and distribution planning process are designed to meet customers' needs timely. And we've done, I think, a pretty fair job of that so far here at SDG&E. An upsized asset, again, I use the word upsized here, but it's really more about the timing. But the upsized asset, if there's an overlap, will allow us to both meet the wildfire needs, PFPS needs, but also ensure that customers are timely served. And this has to do with energization, because we're in business to meet our customers' needs, and that's the purpose of the DPP, to make sure those needs are met timely. And of course, over time, improvements to any of our processes just makes life easier and more efficient. It'll help us identify if there's an overlap and what to do in the event of an overlap. So I just over time, we're going to continue to improve our processes, and those will be reflected in better outcomes for customers. Estimating the cost of upsized projects. Again, no change to our existing planning process as needed by the IGP. And again, I've already said this, any upside like wildfire safety project, which is subject to the risk-based decision-making framework with the appropriate benefit cost analysis there too. There was a question, number 6, I think, was what happens if a wildfire, if the DPP identifies the project crosses into a high fire threat area, what would it do? I think the answer here is pretty simple. Our standards would determine what the design of that project, that upgrade would be in that high fire threat area. So I think that's all the questions, 6 questions. 17. Now if you go to the next slide, And this is the simple example I was referring to. So what I've assumed here is that there's a wildfire mitigation safety project in year 2, where we have an overhead line that's determined that we need to underground that circuit, or part of the circuit, if you will. And that's in year 2. It's about the same time we determine in the DPP process that we need to have a higher capacity project in year 5 on that same circuit. And at the point that we identify this, would be a reconductoring of the overhead line. We get together between the business units on a regular basis, and we, obviously we're going to identify, hey, there's a potential overlap here. What are we going to do? And in this case, I constructed 2 alternatives. Alternative A, we construct as planned, we construct a wildfire mitigation project in year 2, undergrounding with, let's call it a smaller conductor, smaller conduit. And then 3 years later, in year 5, we basically dig that whole thing up, put in a bigger conduit, put in a bigger conductor to meet the capacity need in year 5. So alternative A meets both the wildfire needs and the need for capacity upgrade to meet customer load growth. Alternative B, on the other hand, is we just upgrade the entire undergrounding project in year 2 with a bigger conductor, bigger conduit. And again, that will be both sets of needs, although the capacity obviously gets done earlier than it would otherwise be needed. But so very simple alternatives, A and B. And if you go to the next slide, so these are sort of the comparison between the 2 alternatives, looking at the capital and O&M. So obviously the first alternative A is going to be more expensive because we have to essentially redig the project twice and disconnect and reconnect customers twice rather than once. That has a cost of $4.7 million, based on some rough numbers from our experts. Alternative B, we only do it once, and so the cost is basically half that, or a little more than half of that, because we do have to put in a little bit bigger conductor. So that's $2.5 million. So right off the bat, without doing any other fancy arithmetic, it's obvious what the best solution would be. And I would just also add that, both alternatives meet the needs, both accepted needs. The second alternative B, does meet the capacity need ahead of time. So we are spending money a little earlier than we otherwise would have to. But the time value of that money will not make a difference in our decision here. 3 years worth of time value just doesn't swing the needle when you have this bigger cost difference. There's 2 separate rounds. An alternative A, there's going to be 2 separate rounds of permitting, construction, customer connects, disconnects. Alternative B, you just do it with a single round. I would note on alternative A, for example, on an undergrounding project, cities are not happy when you tear up their streets within a 3-year period to do the same, basically the same thing. So even to get the permits in alternative A might be a challenge to even carry it out. And then the decision, as you can see, is pretty obvious. We're going to go to alternative B. It solves all our needs, and it's going to be more cost effective over the life of the assets. Okay. Next one. Let's talk about stakeholder questions and comments. And hopefully I've addressed all, as I've gone through this presentation, we've tried to address pretty much all the comments received from stakeholders, both from the Energy Division, Cal Advocates, small business. I think was another group that made some comments. Hopefully we've addressed them all here, but if not, we can pick them up at the end. Okay, so the first question was, I think this is one from Cal Advocates, the interaction between RAM and DPP. And I think the simple answer here is selection of the wildfire and how this program is made in accordance with the ramp and the GRC proceedings. Those are where the ramp is filed. Now, I mentioned earlier, but we don't see an overlap being very common. And in fact, just to confirm that, we went back and looked at a couple of years where we had some overlap between the wildfire mitigation plan and the last distribution upgrade project report in 2025, and turned out there was 0 shared projects or projects that share the same facilities. So no overlap there. And then we looked for some other ramp projects and found the same thing. There just isn't any overlap. So not surprising, but we wanted to confirm that there wasn't any overlap. But hypothetically, in the event that there was an overlap, two things. One, the selection of the ramp space decision-making framework type projects wouldn't change. The selection process is laid out in the filing, and it wouldn't change. The only thing that might change theoretically would be the prioritization, to the extent that the project cost of the ramp project changed. So there is that theoretical possibility. But talking to our experts on cost, they say, you know what, like in my little example of the larger and smaller conduit, they said within the bounds of our accuracy of our estimation processes, not that big different. You're not going to see much of a cost difference. So whether this metric would even swing things, probably unlikely. Risk assessments are submitted in the GRC for commission consideration in the event, I forget where this question came from, but in the event that the ramp project was not pursued for whatever reason, we would simply pursue the distribution project to make sure the capacity upgrades or capacity needs were met. Okay, next one. Now, there's a question, I think this came from Public Advocate Office. Could a duper project change during integrated planning? I think it's possible. It's probably going to be quite unlikely. As I mentioned earlier, the real thing that's going on here is we're changing the timing where there's an overlap. So I wouldn't say it would never change, but I think it's a practical matter in most cases. What you're really trying to decide here, what's the appropriate timing to meet all the project needs. The next one, I think we're already at this point again. We typically have minimal cost for these upsizing, if you will, projects. So in my example, I actually had a little bit higher cost for the larger conductor, but as indicated, our experts say that even statistically, for planning purposes, you probably wouldn't even make much of a difference between the two. Okay, when overlaps occurred, we do coordinate across business units, and as I mentioned, that's sort of the core of what our integrated planning is all about. And that coordination will get to a least cost best solution, which is usually obvious without a lot of analysis. And that was my example. Next one, benefit cost analysis, follow standard engineering economics. And I just made a note here that, you know, for a 30-year asset, for example, and the 3-year timing difference, just doesn't make much difference in the final analysis of what the most economic decision is going to be. There's a question about, I think it was from Cal Advocates, about historical costs. Can you use historical costs? And I think, you know, what we've said here is, yeah, historical costs might be useful in certain circumstances, but I think in general, it's going to take a detailed engineering estimate because every project is different and it's really hard to generalize. And so historical costs, therefore, I think are of probably limited value in most cases. Not that we couldn't do it or it wouldn't apply in some cases, but in general, I don't think it's most reliable metric that we could use. And there was a question, I think this is from the small business folks, about the rate of return. We do present value calculations. We use a standard, you know, CPUC authorized rate of return as our discount rate. I think that's around 7 or 8% these days. Okay, next slide. A couple more here. This is I think this is from a Cal Advocates question. Yeah. What, you know, would IGT apply in emergencies or catastrophic event situations? You know, we thought a little bit about this. It would depend obviously on the circumstances and the urgency with which the recovery has to take place. We expected, you know, the overlap of the DTP upgrade to be pretty pretty small. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. We think it's pretty unlikely, but it would be very case specific in any event. And lastly, this is the question again from Cal Advocates. It had to do with, they were asking about accounting for the certainty of known load, the certainty of pending loads. And I just want to clarify here that when we do our distribution planning, we plan to the forecast loads that are used in the distribution planning process. So to the extent known loads are included, and they are, and to the extent pending loads get included pursuant to commission directive, and as everyone knows, that's pending a final commission decision now. But once those loads are included in the forecast, we plan to them and identify upgrades to meet those forecast loads. We don't assign any kind of different certainty level to known loads versus pending loads. We plan to all the loads that are in our forecast, our load forecast. And we made this point many times before, but over time, every cycle we can update, or we do update our planning assumptions. So we're not saying that every load is certain, but we have, through the routine, regular annual cycles, we can continually update our processing to account for changing load level from the system. So it's not as if we're locked into anything indefinitely. And let's see, I guess there's one more slide. So reporting, so I think this is another Cal Advocate set of questions. I think it was like 13, 14, and 15. And I think the point here is we don't regularly document things that we don't do. In other words, things we don't pursue, we don't spend a lot of time keeping track of those details. It's not critical to our business functions. So once we make a decision, we move on. And so reporting on time saving, dispatch, crew dispatch reductions, avoided outages, things like that. We don't really track and keep, document that information if we're not going to pursue the alternative. And I would say it's sort of similar on how many years of an upgrade was advanced. Now, in my example, nominally we advanced the upgrade 3 years. Okay, so we know what that is. But in general, again, we don't keep track of things that we don't pursue. So whether we keep track of those number of years as a general matter, I would say no, we probably wouldn't. All right, so we go, I guess, now just to the wrap-up slide.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you so much. Just to wrap up, as a conclusion of previous 2 workshops, SDG, our standpoint is that we're a small utility company. We have a tightly managed portfolio. Our cross-functional coordination happens on a daily basis. So that makes our project integration simple and also effective. We think that adding extra complexity of the process would bring little benefit at our scale and could introduce additional costs even. At the same time, we still focus on timely execution of our customer needs. That's our priority #1, while at the same time we want to learn from other integrated planning approaches that demonstrate effectiveness and savings. So as required by OP 17, our next step will be to submit the Tier 3 advice letter to document our IGP decision-making methodology. We presented in these 2 workshops and submitted in a data request to ED. The Tier 3 advice letter is due on or before December 15, 2025. That's our next step coming up. With that, we're ready to open the floor for questions.
This is John from Energy Division. I do have a question on. Let me put back the slides. I'm just curious on the breakdown for the projects in alternate A and alternate alternative A and alternative B, because one would be the wildfire project and then the other one's distribution project. Do you have like a breakdown on how much of each attributes to this total?
So, John, I guess what I would say is, I thought about this a little bit after you sent that note yesterday. For year 2, the capital cost is 2.3 million to install sort of the smaller size conduit and conductor on the ground. And then in year 5, you dig it up and do it again. With the bigger conduit conductor, it's 2.5 million. It sums up to about 4.7, do some round off there. So total 4.7, but the two pieces are 2.3 and 2.5. And as you can see in alternative B, single, it's just a single project, which is undergrounding the larger conductor and conduit at 2.5 million. So that's the breakdown that I have. That
Yeah,
answer your question?
Yeah, so in this case, it's almost free to just do it at the same time. How
Yeah.
did your, like, what tools did your team to calculate the cost? Is it like historical cost or?
You know, we consult with our subject matter experts on cost estimation, and this is sort of their conceptual, rough order of magnitude, sort of the set of numbers for undergrounding. I wouldn't attach any more certainty to the numbers than that. It's more or less conceptual, but hopefully in the ballpark.
Okay, thank you. You have a hand raised from Fred Haynes. Go
Yes.
ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. I was just curious, and when you're looking ahead for future capacity needs, I've typically seen numbers around the expected lifetime of conduit and undergrounding systems at like 55 years. I'm wondering if when you're looking out ahead for your capacity needs, would you be looking out that far into the future? So that, that could suggest that in year 20, year 30, you might need future capacity that would make sense to, plan for when you're building the undergrounding project to give it capacity looking that far ahead.
Fred, I appreciate your sentiment there. I think the reality is that, first of all, we don't look beyond about 10 years from a planning perspective. I think you're getting way ahead of yourself when you do that. There's just too many unknowns to push out that far in time. So I don't think you would look that far out, 20 years, and make a decision now to spend more money, even if it's a fairly small amount, the possibility that you might need it 20 years from now. So I guess the short answer is I think we more or less stop at 10 years. Not saying we wouldn't in certain cases go beyond that, but in general, I think that's our practice.
Well, then my follow-up question, I'm also just curious about in designing the conduit for a given installation, is there a practice of just kind of adding in a little extra capacity on that conduit diameter so that maybe it could accommodate, say, pulling more cable through in the future, or is it typically sized just to the minimum needed for the planned service?
I think you're right on the money. As these things turn out, it hasn't been kind of a fluid process. We're in constant communication between the business units. So, the business units are going to know right away, hey, there's a possibility that at some point down the road, we're going to need a bigger conductor here. So let's just put in the next standard size conductor when we do the undergrounding project. And there, in a lot of cases, when we do our studies, then we're going to find out there's no need, no capacity need, because we've already sized appropriately. So it's, I think you'll get confused that there's sort of this, we do this first, and then we do that second, and then we do this third. It's not really like that. It's more of this sort of continual interface type effort to make sure that we're always doing the right engineering, making the smart decision right up front.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Yep.
We have another question from Moon Jun. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, for this particular slide, capital plus O&M cost, is it 4.7 million and 2.5 million, or it's like unit is 1,000, so it's a billion? Because the underground conduit cost for the 4.7 million sounds very little. So
what I did is I did it for like a mile. So these represent the cost for like 1 mile.
per mile. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Anyone have any other questions? I don't see any more hands raised. Yes, Richard.
Hi, it's Richard here from the Public Advocate's Office. I was just interested in slide 18. This integrated planning work is, I think, premised on the idea that there will be overlap between different work streams in the utilities. So, I don't know, between wildfire safety work could overlap with what's needed for, and I know you said DPP identified projects, but let's just call it load growth. I was just interested that your slide 18 says that there's generally little overlap between wildfire safety projects and, if I understood correctly, load growth projects. Yeah, could you just expand on that a little bit more? That was a little bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, we're focused on load growth in our distribution planning work, and pretty much to the exclusion of everything else. And other distribution work streams like aging infrastructure, we just don't directly involve ourselves with that until, we interface with the other business units. It's not our responsibility. And the same with the wildfire mitigation. That's its own separate track. It's in the grant proceeding. It's filed with the GRC, but it's a whole separate business unit that works on wildfire mitigation, identifies what the needs are, and then what the appropriate solutions are. So it just turns out that there just isn't much overlap between those two things. One other little point I would make for our service area, at least, is a lot of our wildfire stuff is out in the backcountry, which tends to be lower density customers, lower load growth. So we have fewer upgrades to the distribution planning process in the wildfire areas in general. I'm not saying it's we don't have some, but in general, there's fewer distribution planning driven upgrades out in the wildfire area. So it's not surprising that we don't have a lot of overlap with the wildfire activities. But I'm not sure what more I can add.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that helps to clarify it. I just wanted to ask another question as well. So I think you said earlier on that the main question, talking about the timing overlap, is really the question is timing, not question of size. So it's like that you'll need to build the project at some point. But I mean, it sort of feels like a lot of the. I've been doing a lot of work in the pending load space, and I know that you touched on that, but it just seems that there are a lot of loads and load growth and therefore grid needs that are uncertain and that you may never need at all. And thinking particularly about freight electrification, it just seems so uncertain. I was at a CEC presentation last Thursday where the CEC has dramatically dropped its freight electrification forecast. And so is it really the case that it's just timing? I mean, can't there be loads or forecasts of load that will just never, could happen, but may never happen, in which case, if you build something there, it may never be needed.
Well, you're right. I mean, there's no guarantees in life, right? We plan to the best forecast that we have at the time. Those loads forecasts are going to change over time, but that's why we have an annual process. So we, every year we can update. So I don't disagree with you that it's possible that we could do something that at the end looks like, well, I wish we hadn't done that. But that's what our annual process is designed to sort of try to catch. that we can update over time. And as you pointed out, we're probably already seeing that with some of the forecast loads on the energy condition. So I'm not sure what else you can really say about that. There's just no way to be certain about what customers are going to do 10 years from now.
But doesn't that mean it's not just a question of timing, but it is actually a question of whether there is a need at all?
Well, we have to plan to something, and so we're going to plan to the load forecast that comes from the Energy Commission, have it adjusted for known loads and tentative loads, and that's the best information we have at the time we have to make our planning decisions. So, there's what more what you can do about that. There's no other way of ensuring certainty here. And maybe I would add just one other thing. You're right. You could make a decision that you wish you would have not built that particular upgrade as big as you did because the load didn't show up. But on the other hand, it could cut the other way too. Things can change in the future where you're going to say, gee, I wish you would have built it larger because load showed up more than we expected. So it cuts both ways too. I think we got to keep our eye on that as well.
Alrighty. I don't think there are any more questions. If people think of questions later on, we will have another time for open discussion. Thank you, SDG&E, for your presentation, and I'd like to hand it over to SCE now.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to continue the discussion here on integrated planning this morning. My name is Michael Berigian. I'll be standing in for Christina and Ricky on SCE's presentation today. I'm the senior manager of our grid policy team within system planning and engineering, and I'm also joined today by various experts on our integrated grid planning team. For today's discussion, we're going to start out with a recap of the key points from Workshop 1, and this will ensure we all have a solid foundation of understanding before we discuss how we propose to satisfy the requirements of ordering paragraph 17. And how, in addition to that, we'll be talking about how integrated planning fits into SCE's overall annual planning process. And then we'll take a moment to walk through preliminary responses to each of the 6 questions from ordering paragraph 17. Before we get into it, just want to mention this is all still very much, being developed and evolving as we continue to discuss these things on a daily basis. All the information in our presentation today represents our current thinking at this time, which is subject to change prior to filing of our Tier 3 advice letter, as SDG&E mentioned, which is targeted for December 15th. Next slide, please. So main takeaways and recap from Workshop 1. Overall, integrated planning is SCE's answer to the challenge of balancing affordability in the face of increasing electrification, the obligation we have to deliver on timely customer energization, and our goal to improve customers' experience by minimizing planned outages. And most importantly, the imperative we have to drive for significant efficiencies in how we scope, design, and execute all of the work that flows through our company. Integrated planning enables us to be thoughtful and proactive in addressing multiple grid needs with a single integrated solution when a set of prerequisite conditions are met. And the goal is to identify those prerequisite conditions and make a determination for when integration would be the most prudent approach. So integrated planning overall is a very broad concept. And as we mentioned in Workshop 1, within Track 1 of the high DER proceeding, we're focused here really on situations where there are known capacity and non-capacity grid needs that coexist on the same assets or line path. And specifically that the capacity need occurs after the non-capacity need. As a reminder, non-capacity needs include things such as infrastructure replacement, which aims to remove antiquated equipment before it runs to failure, and wildfire mitigation, which seeks to reduce or eliminate the risk of ignition. So on the right-hand side of this slide for today's discussion, as I mentioned, we'll focus on the role of engineering guidelines in determining to integrate or not to integrate. We will show where we envision these engineering guidelines will play a role within the broader context of the distribution planning and integrated grid planning processes, and we'll share preliminary responses to the sub-questions within ordering paragraph 17. And as the goal of workshops like this, we will seek feedback from all of you on other considerations that should be taken into account prior to our December advice letter filing. Next slide, please. So taking a little bit of a closer look into the key reminders from workshop 1, in the simplest terms, integrated planning is really aiming to maximize the value of every dollar we spend on the grid. For us, this is not an option. Integrated planning is really an imperative to stretch every customer dollar as far as we possibly can so that we can keep up with the increasing level of load growth and capacity constraints. Affordability is really high on our list, and we know it's of paramount importance to our customers and likely everyone on today's workshop. Integrated planning allows us to reduce design and construction costs by addressing a collection of needs in a geographic location with a single integrated solution. This allows us to do more with every dollar we spend. And overall, our resources are very constrained. As it is today, we face resource bottlenecks with critical staff like engineers and technical designers. And we know the solution cannot just be to double or triple our headcount. Integrated planning helps us avoid sending folks to the same location multiple times when it can be done once, and to avoid things like pulling base maps and developing detailed technical designs for an area, just to have to go back and do it again for a different issue a few years down the line. When we find out those maps we just spent a bunch of time pulling and developing are now obsolete and need to be updated. Customer experience is also highly important to us, and we know how problematic it can be when customers are faced with a planned outage. When we address multiple grid needs with an integrated solution, we avoid the need to take multiple outages to perform work in the same area. Integrated planning overall allows us to drive towards spending our limited personnel and capital resources wisely, and we 100% want to and need to do that. Next slide, please. So quick reminder on this slide of the important distinction between integrated planning and integrated execution. So want to make sure the terminology we use here at SCE is understood by stakeholders here. So integrated planning for us is developing a holistic solution that addresses multiple grid needs before a work order is created for field design and construction. That's how we enable those efficiencies, by doing the single design and single deployment of a crew to an area. Integrated execution, on the other hand, is slightly different. This focuses on executing work in the same area at the same time. So at SCE, we sometimes use the word bundling interchangeably with integrated execution. And this is really where you have multiple sets of disparate grid needs or grid upgrades that are not sharing the same line segments or line path, but they're within relatively close proximity so that a crew dispatched to that area can do the work at the same time and potentially under the same outage. So in practice, we may actually end up with a combination of integrated and non-integrated solutions in the same geographic area. That's also another good opportunity where bundling would drive for execution efficiency. And the bottom part of this slide, we have the 4 dimensions of integration that we introduced in workshop 1. But I wasn't planning to go through these dimensions in any detail here, but as you can see, integrated planning considers drivers, voltage levels, time, and asset type, as we discussed, as I said, in workshop 1. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So I think this is probably the meat of our proposal, which stakeholders may find most interesting here. We've updated the process diagram from workshop 1 with some key modifications here. So this is really a representation of the addition of engineering guidelines for integration into our overall distribution planning and integrated grid planning processes, as you can see in the yellow diamond in the center. So in terms of overview, our integrated planning process combines capacity needs from distribution planning with other non-capacity grid needs, as I mentioned earlier, like wildfire, infrastructure replacement, and reliability improvements. Capacity needs, as Richard mentioned in his question, are really driven by load growth. In many cases, these capacity needs are driven primarily by customer energization requests. However, starting with this current plan cycle, we're going to see those capacity needs also driven to some degree by pending loads. Capacity solutions are designed to ensure the grid can meet future demand, essentially that customers who want to energize can be energized when they're requesting to be. Non-capacity needs include a variety of different programs, wildfire hardening, aging asset replacement, reliability upgrades. Non-capacity solutions are focused on reducing risk that a negative outcome will occur, such as outages and/or impacts to safety. And historically, these non-capacity projects were typically handled as like-for-like replacements. Essentially, whatever is out there is antiquated, needs to be replaced. We'll put back exactly what was there before. So as we see in step 1 here within the dashed box here where it says consolidate grid needs, for integrated planning, this is where we're really enabled to visualize grid needs across the system, again, both capacity and non-capacity driven needs, so that it can be readily apparent to us where an integrated solution may be an opportunity. And we envision this, as we shared in workshop 1, as a geospatial map where all of these grid needs are mapped out based on their location. So we can look at that map and, like I said, quickly identify where integration could be an opportunity. So flowing out of step 1, the yellow diamond, we again see the essence of our proposal here to satisfying OP17. This is the application of engineering guidelines to determine when to integrate and when not to. So if we follow this, this decision diamond down to the bottom, if the answer to that quick check is no, the non-integrated capacity solutions will follow a conventional path to design and construction and will be published in our distribution upgrade project report, or the DUPR. However, if the engineering guidelines for integration indicate that integration makes the most sense, we'll develop a holistic integrated solution to address the collection of grid needs. And this will likely include addressing the capacity need earlier than it would otherwise occur if it were not to be integrated. The third step focuses on scoring and scheduling work over the longer term and ensuring that we're optimizing the geographic execution of work within a given year. We touched on this in workshop 1. This is really unchanged. The result of that step 3 is a work plan that prioritizes our highest value work and optimizes the dispatch of resources by region and respects constraints such as capital and resources. So a new addition on this slide is the addition of the risk-based decision-making framework. So we saw a lot of questions about that in ordering paragraph 17. So wanted to clearly call out and illustrate here that integrated planning is not seeking to make any modifications to the details or the role of the RDF or to override conclusions as a result of integrated planning. So we show it here as an input in the optimization stage. So we envision RDF and integrated planning and the distribution planning process are really concepts that work in conjunction. Finally, on the far right side of this, non-capacity projects will follow a traditional path of reporting through the GRC and other compliance reports that we're required to file, and integrated capacity projects will rejoin the non-integrated capacity projects in the distribution upgrade project report. So similar to what I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're still working through all of the required changes to the GNA and the DUPR and our annual reporting, especially with the recent draft resolutions on pending loads and scenario planning. So we're working through, considering how all these reports need to be updated to capture the outputs of integrated planning. And that also applies to how we structure our general rate case. So we're starting conversations internally for how that may change or need to change as a result of integrated planning. So our goal, though, remains to be to produce information in these reports in a way that is clear and comprehensive for our stakeholders. All right, so let's take a closer look at the engineering guidelines for integration in the yellow diamond and move on to the next slide. All right, so we went back and looked at the staff proposal from track 1. We found the inequality that you see described in the box on this slide. Essentially, that is the increased cost of the current project less than the probability of the future grid need multiplied by the cost of the potential distribution capacity project adjusted via discount rate. So based on a general comparison of the cost to mobilize a crew to perform work on the grid and having to take an outage to do so, to the incremental cost of, for example, a larger conductor size, our experience shows that the incremental cost of an integrated solution is almost always going to be less than the cost of proceeding with separate projects. That would require us to return to the same area a few years later and potentially removing equipment that was recently installed to replace it with upgraded equipment. So in other words, it's certainly possible to do work on the same assets or same line path a year or two later, but in many cases, we believe strongly that it is self-evident the benefits of addressing multiple grid needs together outweighs the costs. When grid needs occur within 1 to 2 years of another, integration absolutely makes sense. But what about if the grid needs are 5 years or 6 years apart? Is it always still the best decision? While we strongly believe that it will be, this is what we're planning to work through as we create these clear guidelines for our engineers to determine whether we should be pulling forward some grid needs, some capacity grid needs, so they can be addressed in conjunction with the earlier non-capacity needs. So I want to take a moment to discuss a little bit further the role of probability on this slide. I think similar to many of the comments from San Diego, with the recent resolutions on pending loads and scenario planning, we believe the probability of a capacity need occurring is adequately addressed in 2 places. First, in the categorization of pending loads based on their confidence level and the implied likelihood of those pending loads materializing in the form of a formal customer energization request. And second, in the detailed decision logic applied within scenario planning, in which we will propose a single investment plan that considers a diverse range of outcomes across 3 forecast scenarios. By virtue of evaluating 3 forecast scenarios, where we historically have only evaluated a single deterministic forecast scenario, we believe we're inherently considering probability in the annual planning process. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. All right, so let's take a minute to discuss when these engineering guidelines would apply and why guidelines are SCE's recommended approach. So as mentioned earlier, 2 prerequisites must be met to be eligible for application of the engineering guidelines for integration. First, we must have a non-capacity need present before a known capacity need. And second, those needs must coexist on the same assets or the same line path. If only the first criteria is met, that you have a non-capacity need before a known capacity need, there may still be a valid opportunity for bundled execution. Like I mentioned earlier, that includes constructing the upgrades in the same area at the same time, potentially under the same outage with the same crew. But if only the first criteria is met, integration is not seen as an option because those needs are on different assets or line paths. So a single holistic solution is less likely to be the desired solution here. The essence of these engineering guidelines for integration are to really identify whether addressing the later capacity need at the time of the earlier non-capacity need is a more optimal choice than pursuing independent projects. And as I mentioned on the last slide, we believe the timing difference between the grid needs will be one of, if potentially not the only differentiating factor in making this decision. And that's what we're planning to explore further here. So another brief note on terminology. We see the phrase increased sizing in ordering paragraph 17, and in workshop 1, we use the term upsizing quite frequently actually in our own presentation. But I just wanted to note that upsizing and integrating are not synonymous for us. In some cases, an integrated project may be just that. It may be using a larger conductor size instead of a like-for-like replacement. But in other cases, an integrated solution may lead us to a completely different approach. And maybe one example just to offer to illustrate what that could look like. We had a 4 kV substation in our territory that was due for rebuild due to its age. And we recognized that that area was also facing a future capacity constraint. So instead of just rebuilding that 4 kV system with simply larger conductor size that would still inevitably prove to limit the area's capacity, we decided to cut over the substation to a higher voltage altogether. So this is a 4 kV cutover that addressed the needs of both infrastructure replacement and forecasted capacity, and it ended up leading us to a completely different solution than simply increasing the wire size. As we continue to see increased levels of load growth on the horizon, we continue to prioritize affordability, customer experience, and operating within the personnel and resource constraints that we face. It is essential for SCE that we enable a streamlined approach to integration decision-making. We simply do not have the time or resources to perform a project-by-project evaluation for every line segment that meets the prerequisites previously discussed. In doing so, we think that would really rob the efficiencies that we're setting out to pursue and achieve here with integrated planning. So I believe with that, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Okay. So as with anything really in the engineering space, guidelines are intended to be just that, guidance for the most common situations we expect to encounter, while also accepting that these guidelines will not cover all corner cases. Guidelines are not a substitute for sound engineering judgment. We envision that even once the guidelines are created, there may be situations that require deviation from those guidelines. However, as I mentioned previously, these guidelines are really intended to provide a consistent starting point that addresses the majority of situations. All right. So with that, I think we're going to transition into now the sub-questions from ordering paragraph 17, maybe 2 slides ahead. Great. If you give, great, thank you. All right, so I expect folks will hear a lot of commonality in SCE's responses to these questions to what we heard from our counterparts at San Diego. So starting with question one was focused on flexibility of the distribution planning process. And as we saw in the flow chart earlier in our presentation, the proposed approach we're planning to take here does not place any restrictions or constraints on our distribution planning process because it is applied to the results of the distribution planning process. So we don't see this as imposing any constraints on the DPP. The DPP should continue to be allowed to evolve as necessary. Those proposed guidelines will help us understand whether the grid needs should be addressed with an integrated solution, not whether the projects themselves should be done or not. Let's move to question 2. So question 2 is around estimating the increased costs for current projects. So similar to our response for question 1, our proposed approach will not result in any increased costs due to wildfire mitigation, as wildfire mitigation projects are identified through the WMP process, and that is then fed into the first step of integrated planning, where we consolidate capacity and non-capacity needs. When it comes to the role of the RDF in integrated planning, we see the 2 concepts as separate, as I mentioned previously. They are related, but they're incompatible, as the RDF aims to mitigate the risks identified in RAMP, which is a fundamentally different definition of risk. Next slide, please. Question 3 touches upon cost effectiveness and cost efficiencies. So as mentioned throughout the presentation, we strongly believe that in almost all conditions, it is more cost effective to address consolidated grid needs with an integrated solution rather than dispatching crews to the same location multiple times. And also, as mentioned in the presentation, it is absolutely essential that we take a streamlined and efficient approach to the decision-making around integration. Our proposed approach to apply guidelines alleviates the burden on our engineering resources by avoiding the need to scope and cost estimate individual and integrated solutions, simply to make a comparison between the 2. This process is time-consuming and tedious, and it is for an already heavily constrained resource, our engineers and our technical designers. Let's move to the next slide. Question 4 on adjusting for risk and risk reduction. So as we mentioned in workshop 1, the risk of missing or delaying a customer's requested energization is fully mitigated by upsizing to meet capacity needs, especially when that occurs within the first 5 years of the planning horizon. The probability of capacity needs beyond year 6 are informed by the DPP, As mentioned earlier, the inclusion of pending loads and scenario planning incorporate the confidence the load will materialize to balance risk with proactive planning. Risk is appropriately considered in non-capacity needs, such as through RAMP and WMP, which are both very robust processes. Next slide, please. Question 5 around estimating the cost of future distribution capacity projects. So the short answer here is that we're not changing the way we develop cost estimates for integrated projects. So we'll still follow the same general practices of preparing an itemized list of equipment and using unit costs to produce a cost estimate for the total project. And similar to our response for question 2, wildfire needs and projects are handled within the WMP and then are fed into the first step of integrated planning. So this approach will not result in increased costs due to wildfire mitigation. Next slide. So this is the last question from OP17. It's around specific considerations for projects in wildfire risk areas. Again, the short answer on this one is we are currently and will continue to build infrastructure to appropriately mitigate the risk of wildfire where needed. Design considerations in wildfire risk areas include underground infrastructure and covered conductor. And integrated planning will not change how we approach mitigating the risks of wildfire. So this is actually our last slide. So a few closing remarks. Our integrated planning approach really is driving for greater project scoping and execution efficiencies while maintaining affordability, improving our customer experience, and ensuring timely customer energization. Integrated planning allows us to drive towards spending our limited resources as wisely as possible. And consistent with the overall objective of integrated planning to drive efficiencies, the approach to integration decision-making must also be streamlined to be effective. And we are 100% aligned with the CPUC's objective of integrated planning to drive efficiencies, plan the system with an appropriate level of proactivity, and really to stretch every customer dollar as far as possible. These things matter greatly to us because for every decision to advance a capacity need comes with trade-offs. Something else can't be done or must be done later as a result of that decision. So we're going to continue to put thought into our proposed approach as we develop our advice letter for ordering paragraph 17. And with that, we can open it up for any questions.
I see a few hands raised. Richard?
Hi there, it's Richard from the Public Advocate's Office. I guess I've been interested in both SDG&E and SCE's comments about the connection between integrated planning and the pending load and scenario planning work that I think we've all had our heads in the last few weeks. I think it is important to consider the probabilities of the load growth. I mean, if the load growth is only, say, a 5% chance, then surely you'd factor that in and you'd be less likely to increase the size of a project. But I guess I'm just trying to get my head around the scenario, the way you'd use the pending load and scenario planning framework to kind of cover that off. And if I've followed, I think you're saying that the pending load and scenario planning frameworks kind of factor in the likelihood of the potential future load, and then give the utilities a framework, maybe like a recipe for how you combine different scenarios, which each contain different types of pending load, and then through the decision logic, offer a way to reconcile different outcomes from different scenarios. And are you proposing, therefore, that it could be the decision logic and applying the different scenarios that guides the utilities on how to make a call on whether to build bigger in the case of integrated planning? So I know that the SCE decision logic was used as an example in the scenario planning draft resolution. So that said, well, if the high scenario says you build you need to build a circuit, the base scenario doesn't, well, the SCE decision logic in the example says you build out to the first switch. Are you somehow thinking that that would provide guidance for the utilities in how to make decisions around building bigger within the integrated planning context?
Thanks for the question, Richard. So slightly different. The way that I would describe it is we see that the pending load and scenario planning approaches adequately capture the probability that the load growth need will materialize, and we'll be producing through those processes and through the annual planning process a single capacity investment plan, which already considers the probability, right? So pending loads will categorize the load, the pending loads based on their confidence, the level of information, the level of detail, and then allocate those pending loads to different forecast scenarios, where then the detailed decision logic will again consider the probability and distribution of those grid needs across the 3 forecast scenarios to result in a single investment plan. And then that single investment plan is fed into the integrated planning process as we showed on the flow chart. So for us, it wouldn't really make sense to try to consider probability again once the distribution planning process has already adequately considered the probability.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, up next we have a question from Cole Germain from ADF. And then go ahead, I have unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, I apologize if you covered this, but can you explain again the thinking behind the first criteria you talked through for when the logic is used of the capacity needs to show up after the non-capacity need? Like, why does it need to be in that order versus just having a capacity and a non-capacity need?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that is all basically oriented towards what the specific scope of high DER track 1 is, which is really asking the question of when does it make sense to address a later capacity need? In our look of an understanding of the staff proposal, the decision and ordering paragraphs, it's really looking at, again, when does it make sense to address the capacity need earlier than it otherwise would be needed if you did not have an unrelated non-capacity grid need on the same assets earlier in the plan. So it's really around kind of the scoping of the, the questions that were presented in the decision and the focus of the workshops here.
Okay, got it. So theoretically, like, there may be situations where it does make sense from a cost effectiveness perspective to do a like holistic integrated planning, based upgrade in the opposite scenario where you have a capacity need that shows up and a non-capacity need that you expect later on. But SCE just sees that as outside of the scope of what the commission asked for integrated planning here.
Yeah, I would say that's generally correct. And I would also add to that is, if these needs coexist on the same assets and the optimal solution to address the capacity need includes replacing the assets, then we will inherently replace those assets with ones that satisfy the non-capacity needs. So if the later need was infrastructure replacement due to antiquated equipment, for example, just by virtue of replacing the assets, we would address the infrastructure replacement need. If the later need was of wildfire mitigation, for example, we would build the new assets to the appropriate wildfire mitigation standards.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Anyone have any more questions? I think I don't see any more hands raised. Alrighty, thank you, SCE, for your presentation. And I believe we would be heading on to a 10-minute break. It is now 10:25, so we will reconvene at 10:35 a.m. Thank you. Good, welcome back everyone. We'll continue with the workshop. Up next would be PG and E.
Hey everyone, this is Wentu, Senior Director of Integrated Grid Planning here at Pacific Gas and Electric. I'm going to provide a little bit of context to our presentation today during this workshop, and I will hand it over to my peers within planning. In workshop one, PG&E focused on our development, introducing our development of our integrated grid planning process, which is something that we're currently developing with intentions of utilizing the process to perform targeted work planning in 2026 for work that's starting in 2027. Within that process, we have not changed any existing process in relation to RDF, WMP, and GRC, which is some of the questions that came up after the workshop. And as RDF Phase 4 was just recently published, we're currently evaluating requirements to developing solutions on how IGP supports and complements both existing processes and address new requirements. After workshop one, in assessing the questions that came up during the workshop and in writing afterwards, we believe that our distribution planning process, which is upstream of the imagined IGP process, is what actually addresses OP 16, 17, and the raised questions. And so we will today double click on that upstream process, the distribution planning process, and also explain the integration of that process with other types of work planning, specifically wildfire risk mitigation and circuit hardening type work. And so with that, I am going to introduce Brad Dudgeon. He's our manager for area planning, and he has various other SMEs that are on the line as well. Brad?
Hi, good morning all, and thanks for attending the workshop and providing this opportunity to talk about our approach to asset sizing. As this agenda lays out, we'll talk about some specific areas and project types where upsizing is possible and where it is considered. We'll talk about our approach to engineering evaluation based on standards that determines when we pursue these opportunities to upsize. Talk about the economic criteria and tools that engineers have at their disposal to make those ultimate decisions when necessary. And we'll talk a little bit about exception cases and limits of application. So next slide. This slide we presented many times before, and we presented in workshop one. This is the overview of our distribution planning process, and it just helps ground us here in what provides the basic input data to make these asset sizing decisions. What I'll emphasize here is the first two blue boxes on the left, the forecast development and the determination of grid requirements. It is the standard distribution planning process forecast that engineers use when determining whether to upsize equipment. That would determine the future load on a given asset. In some cases, the opportunities to upsize would be at that asset that may be overloaded in the future in the forecast. In some other cases, in the second box, after the engineer has determined the grid requirements, they may identify that there's an opportunity to resolve a future overload by upsizing a conductor on an adjacent circuit and enabling a transfer. So it's helpful to have the grid requirements known, and our distribution plan that has our preliminary mitigation designs for forecasted overloads is important to informing these sizing decisions. Next slide. So I want to hone in on the very specific cases where that we're focused on in considering ordering paragraph 17. And these are cases where, exactly as SCE outlines, there is a non-capacity project, and in the later years after that non-capacity project is completed, there may be a emergent capacity need. And so the two types of non-capacity project that are most relevant for our work are substation asset replacement projects. Think of an aged transformer that fails testing and will need to be replaced. The just-in-time replacement within the next 2 years. A decision might be made by a capacity planning engineer to potentially upsize the transformer that we go back with. And then secondly, on the bottom, a wildfire-driven project, as supporting paragraph 17 explicitly refers to, where we are undergrounding or we are hardening overhead conductor and identifying whether we need to upsize that cable or conductor. Fundamentally, either of those decisions would be made by the capacity planning engineer who has ownership over that circuit from a planning and design standpoint. We are structured so that we have local distribution engineering offices. Each circuit in the system has a capacity planning engineer who owns that circuit, and then we also have senior engineers who have visibility over a larger area and can make higher level decisions about substation assets. And so in either a substation asset replacement or a wildfire driven project, there are teams outside of capacity planning who create the preliminary designs and preliminary scope, and then submit those designs to the capacity planning engineer who has ownership over that circuit or that substation from a capacity standpoint. That engineer makes the review, makes the determination about whether to go back with the smaller standardized size, the next size up standardized size, or something larger to address future needs. And that's primarily informed by the forecast as shown as on the prior slide. Our planning forecast is what we're focused on here. So that is our 10-year forecast horizon with a preliminary mitigation plan telling us where we would plan to build out new feeders, new banks to address future growth. Again, as Wen alluded to, all of this is upstream of the integrated grid planning team who will find, once the project is scoped, the integrated grid planning team will look for opportunities to bundle that project with other projects that are in an adjacent area. So it is really these in this upstream preliminary cross-functional design review by capacity planning that we identify these opportunities to upsize and pursue them. Next slide. So fundamentally, our approach to this decision is that engineers who have the tools and backgrounds on the area to thoroughly investigate the costs and benefits of upsizing make that decision, and they make that decision through an engineering evaluation that is grounded in our standards. And so I'll talk a little bit about what the standards mean very specifically in the context of these types of projects. And I hope that this slide helps us kind of get our hands around the breadth of options that are available, which is there are not so many different sizing options because we are grounded in our standards. So if you look at the table, if we're undergrounding tap line, there's really only one standard option. If we're undergrounding mainline, there's a smaller and a larger option. Hardening overhead, there are essentially, depending whether you're in interior or coastal areas, there are 3 different overhead tree wire hardened overhead options, and replacing substation transformers, there are a few different transformer sizes that are possible, that are approved by our standards. And so the engineer is selecting between these. So in many cases, in fact, in most cases, as SCE and SCG&E have both pointed out, installing a larger component to address a future capacity need at the time that the non-capacity project is being performed is a very cost-effective way to address that future capacity need. It is much less expensive in most cases than going back and performing that work in a later year when that need emerges. So in the case of undergrounding mainline, you'll note that both of the size options are in 6-inch conduit. So when we are trenching for undergrounding, we're putting in 6-inch conduit mainline. That can fit either of these conductor options. And so there is a minimal impact on labor, permitting. It is essentially just material cost to go to the larger inline size. And so if the engineer sees that there is a need in a future year, if there is growth in the future year, then they will probably make the decision to upsize. The same goes when replacing a substation transformer. If there's space in the substation for a larger substation transformer, if there are enough feeders in the low side bus to support the ultimate growth on that bank, then the engineer will go in with a larger bank, as long as there's a need in the forecast showing the need for that larger bank. Now, I am noting in hardening overhead and in replacing substation transformers, there are cases where you can trigger significant additional scope by proposing a larger asset. That can be if you're if you are, let's say, on a winding country road with a lot of turns and steep embankments on either side, and you putting in a larger conductor means you need more poles, larger poles, spaced more closely together, different framing requirements, different guying requirements. This can expand the scope of the project, slow it down, possibly impact timing. Same with replacing a substation transformer. If you don't have space for it in its current footprint, you're going to need to move assets around inside the substation. That becomes a more complex decision. And so fundamentally, it needs to be an engineer who's aware of all of these different parameters, who is making the determination in consideration of project timing needs, scope, constructability, permitting requirements, as well as cost and long-term needs, who makes the determination of whether to upsize at the time the non-capacity project is being performed. Next slide. So it is the forecast, as I mentioned, that is used by the engineer. And here we'll talk a little bit about some of the questions about pending loads and scenario planning. We, in our load steer tool, we have a 16-year load forecast, but in our annual planning process, we are coming up with an area plan that goes out to 10 years. That informs where we plan to expand our assets in order to address that future growth. And then we have a specific actionable 5-year bank and feeder project plan that we are moving into our investment plan, as well as a 3-year line section investment plan. In response to the question about how we maintain the flexibility of the distribution planning process, we will include pending loads and scenario planning in these forecasts according to the draft decision, which illustrates how, fundamentally our approach to engineering evaluation grounded in our standards is flexible to changes in the distribution planning process. We can change the way the forecast is constructed, and engineers will still just use that forecast and apply it to making this asset decision. In the case of scenario planning, when we look at a high, a low, and a base scenario, engineers will refer to each of those in making their risk-based evaluation of the likelihood of growth occurring in the future years and justifying that project. But as mentioned before, there are considerations beyond solely cost and growth, including the constructability and the timing of the projects, and the level of confidence in the load growth as well. And finally, I wanted to emphasize our ultimate design review, which goes beyond simply load, but is also about once we fully utilize the substation resource in order to serve a given area, we have a substation ultimate design at many of our substations that says, based on the high side voltage and the acreage that we have at this parcel, we'll eventually put in this number of substation transformers, and we're designing the substation to eventually be able to accommodate all of that equipment. Now, that can be looking far beyond the horizon of our forecast, and it may not be for another 50 years that we reach that ultimate design, or it may never ultimately happen, but it informs some of the design decisions that are made in terms of what kind of bus to put in on the high side and the low side, and then how many transformers we can ultimately install. Next slide. So to return to the core message, it is fundamentally grounded in our standards that our distribution engineers are making these decisions, but they have to undertake a project-specific engineering analysis, and that considers considerations beyond specifically cost, but also, as I mentioned, permitting, constructability, timing, outages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So, next slide. To be a little more specific about what we mean by our standards. It's outlined in our electric planning manuals, our design manuals, specific design guidelines that are referred to by our distribution engineers, how they should size equipment. And this is specific. It allows engineers to build the forecast according to our standards and then apply that forecast to making sizing decisions. It also allows those sizing decisions to consider things like operational flexibility in the future. And it allows, in the case of economical distribution conductors, our design guideline on that advises how to minimize losses and weigh the cost of increased losses with smaller conductor against the cost of upsizing conductor in the initial years. So this is just a sampling of the standards that are applied by our engineers when making these sizing decisions. But this has been developed over decades by expert engineers within PG&E. Next slide. So I've alluded several times to some of these project-specific considerations that go beyond simply cost. I mentioned timing. So this is matching the forecasted growth with when we're able to perform the project. I mentioned permitting. If we're expanding the scope of the project in a way that is going to trigger additional permitting requirements, and we're potentially endangering the timeline of the hardening project, that's going to make a significant difference in how we consider upsizing. Of course, forecasted growth, both in the forecast, in the base forecast, and as well as in the high and low forecast. So, which is the way that we consider different levels of certainty in growth and in bending loads. Material lead times, making sure that we're making decisions far enough out that we can purchase long lead time materials like high voltage breakers based on the long-term forecast, but maintaining some flexibility to potentially move that equipment between projects if necessary. And operational flexibility. I mentioned that there can be a need, say, on a hardening project to put in larger main line to enable transfers from a neighboring circuit during clearances or during peak summer loading conditions. And so it can go sometimes beyond just growth at that one point. So again, these are all these different factors that go into this decision. But economics is a core one, and is minimizing the cost is absolutely essential, and making sure that we don't go back and repeat work in the same area is also essential. And so in some cases, the engineer needs to undertake a more thorough economic analysis, and the next slide will show a little bit about how they would do that. Next slide here. So to start with, at the time that this decision is made, we don't have a detailed design, which means that the economic assessment is grounded in some quantifiable cost factors and some that have not yet been quantified. So on the left, some of the quantifiable cost factors is we have a preliminary design. We know how many feet of cable or conductor we're replacing. We can come up with a preliminary device count for how many switches or effective devices we're installing on the circuit. And then we can come up with a preliminary estimate of the costs based on our unit costs. PG&E refreshes its unit costs based on historical cost data in each of its GRC cycles. And so we've recently refreshed ours for the 2027 through 2030 GRC. That has different unit costs based on region. Based on construction type overhead versus underground, new trench versus existing underground conduit. But it's not specific to, it doesn't differentiate between different cable or conductor sizes because, as both SV and SDG&E alluded to, the increase in material costs by upsizing conductors often relatively small compared to the cost of doing an entire project. But again, detailed designs are not available yet, and so the engineer needs to have some, enough knowledge of construction methods that they can consider some of those potential cost risks. So they might look at, the space in the right of way, the terrain, consider access and working space to the poles or to the substation equipment. They may consider whether they're working in an area where assets are newly installed and healthy versus older and deteriorating. They may think about how the poles will be spaced out along the line, and all those things will help give them a sense of whether those unit costs are likely to be on the high or the low side. That can help inform that decision. Next slide. So in some cases, the engineer may be looking at two different design alternatives that are happening in different years, like upfront, installing a larger asset up front and or doing it multiple times in future years, and find that their engineering evaluation doesn't make a clear decision about which will be lowest cost on a net present cost basis. And so we do have internal tools that allow the engineers to weigh different alternatives side by side. So our ESOP tool is our standardized company-wide economic analysis tool. It integrates our company cost of capital and allows the engineer to weigh different projects, capital costs alongside expense costs, or project in different years. And so the example shown in the graph is imagining a substation where eventually we need 60 MVA of additional capacity to support growth, and the question of whether to install that 60 MVA as a new bank in the initial years of the forecast, or to do a cheaper bank replacement to add 30 MVA in the nearer years, and then later another bank replacement to add another 30 MVA in a year beyond that. And so this kind of shows that alternative A, to install the larger bank up front, would be the lowest net present cost alternative, even though it's not the cheapest up front. And so this is the kind of decision an engineer can make with these economic analysis tools, and to consider capital expense and net present cost or time value of money. Next slide. So a lot of this is sort of recap of what I've already said, so I won't go through it in too much detail, but essentially the top line is this is the scope of the ordering paragraph that we're focused on, these non-capacity projects with forecasted capacity needs in future years. Engineers will make the decision in consideration of many different factors, but grounding it in our standards. The decision will be made by local distribution engineers who have intimate knowledge of the area and of the circuits, with support of senior engineers who may have more experience but have a broader purview. The senior engineers will make the decision on at the substation level and at the level of the larger investments. An engineering evaluation is not replaceable in this process. It can't be distilled to a simple cost benefit formula alone. But there are cases where it comes down to an economic trade-off, and we need a tool like ESOP to demonstrate that. So this is the balance that our approach to upsizing is striking. Next slide. This just outlines a little bit more the types of projects that we're considering and all of the different inputs that engineers use in helping to make these decisions. Don't need to, I think with in consideration of time, I don't need to linger too much on this slide. I think we can skip forward to it, the exception cases slide, which is in 2 slides. So finally, want to just illustrate some specific cases where some of these non-cost factors might impact the engineer's decision. If an area is limited in its transfer capabilities, if the planning engineer in consultation with operations knows that it is difficult for operations to clear a bank in the area or to perform transfers when there's an outage, to restore customers in an outage, then it's important to be able to enhance those transfer capabilities. So there may be a need to upsize conductor for that reason. The engineer may know in the area, that there are future needs beyond the forecast, like a vacant lot zoned for development. Maybe that is a pending load, but maybe it's one that hasn't entered our pending load database yet. And that is something an engineer will want to be able to consider. If the engineer knows that there's planned or likely work in the area, like if a substation bank at the same substation is aging and is likely to need replacement soon, that might shift the cost benefit equation. Or if the increased scope will impact the timing of the project and put the non-capacity project at risk, like if putting in a larger substation transformer requires a full rearrangement of the high voltage bus in the substation, or if there isn't room for the guy wire to support the framing on the larger poles that are needed to support the larger conductor. And then to the last side, again, want to just refocus again on specifically the scope of the ordering paragraph as we've read it, which is this is applying to instances where a non-capacity project replaces an asset and we see a later capacity need. There would be other design standards that are informing how we approach capacity projects, like our economical conductor sizing standard, how we design for spares, and how we route the feeder. And there are, considerations in the designs that are not specifically sizing, like how we arrange the substation high side and low side buses. And so those are all factors that are, we are not focused on and will not be addressing in the advice letter. So in summary, our approach to upsizing is fundamentally to provide engineers with the tools and guidelines via our standards, and to assess many different factors impacting the costs and benefits of the project, and also with the tools to perform side-by-side net present cost economic analysis, and then ultimately allow the engineer to make the decision for the non-capacity project. Thank you.
We are now heading to a Q&A session. Please raise your hand or put a message in the chat if you have any questions. I received a chat question from LAJ Justine. Sorry.
Yeah, the question is about advanced conductors, and I just want to confirm that you're referring to, say, like conductors with non-steel cores, or can you be specific about advanced conductors, or what do you mean there?
I have unmuted you.
Struggling with the mute there. Yes, that is correct. That's what I'm referring to. Particularly if you have to add larger or more poles, an example you gave on a winding country road, that is clearly expensive.
Yeah. So as a company, our approach to advanced conductors is for our standards team to evaluate the technology and integrate it into our standards. And as of today, that is not a standard option that our distribution engineers can employ, because we don't have approved material codes for advanced conductors. So it would not be used, but that doesn't propose applying it in the future if that is approved by our standards group.
Well, I guess that leads to a natural follow-up question of what the time frame is for the evaluation of such a technology.
I'm not prepared to talk about that in this call. I would need someone from our standards group to speak to that.
No, that's great. Is there going to be an opportunity to follow up in writing?
Maybe someone from Energy Division can speak to specifically on follow-ups, but yeah, we'd be happy to support some follow-up in writing.
Thank you.
Yeah, with regards to the follow-up, I have set the schedule 2 weeks from now. similar to workshop number 1, where parties can send questions to the service list. And I can talk more about that later on. Anyone have any more questions? I don't see any more hands up. I believe we'll be going to open discussion. So thank you, PG&E, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'll now open it to open discussion. So if folks have any questions to any of the IOUs, or if there's any questions to Energy Division. I guess I do have one question. It's John from Energy Division. I'm just curious on the cost of the capacity upgrades and upsizing. I'm guessing that the cost is majority towards like labor cost instead of material cost. For the IOU, so do you have like an approximation on how much percentage goes towards just the materials versus labor? Because when we do integrate projects and work at the same time, we save a lot of money from avoiding duplicating labor cost. And it seems from the presentation that I've seen from the IOUs, it's almost seems like the extra cost to upside is just significantly cost effective.
I can give an initial response. I'm sure the other IUs will have more to add. It is true that labor is a larger component of our total project costs than materials are in most cases. But specifically for upsizing, there are many cases where the cost of upsizing is primarily materials. So if you consider the example of undergrounding, where you are going to put in 6-inch rigid conduit no matter what, all of the equipment is going to be 600 amp rated equipment no matter what. That's what our PG&E standards would dictate. The engineering decision about sizing is whether to put in 600 aluminum or 1100 aluminum conductor, 2 different conductor sizes, is essentially similar construction approaches, similar labor, independent of which conductor or cable you install. And so it's mostly the material costs that make the difference. And that's the main reason that that upsizing can be such a cost-effective way to add new capacity on a circuit or in a substation compared to doing a new project in a future year.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Michael. Just to add to Brad's response, which I generally agree with. I think when we talk about the ratio of labor costs to equipment costs, we should also keep in mind it's not just the labor to actually go out and construct the upgrade or construct the grid, but it's also the labor that's needed to identify the solution and go through the technical detailed design process, to pull permits, to pull base maps, and all of those things that lead up to the actual solution, whether it's an independent solution or an integrated solution. And that, I think, is, again, one of the contributing factors that more often than not creates a ratio where the labor costs are a significantly larger component than the material costs.
So, Jan, San Diego, my rule of thumb is costs are 99% labor. Start from that point. I wouldn't really have much more to add. I don't have anything else to add to what Brad and Michael just said, though. We agree.
Got it. Thank you. Last call for any other questions or comments. Yes, Richard.
I just wanted to make a comment. Having thought about the first workshop and now thought about this one, it sort of feels like there's a bit of a different theme coming through, maybe a stronger theme coming through this workshop compared to the first one, which is really from the utilities that the existing processes that they have, particularly the existing capacity planning processes, are already sufficiently accommodating what IGP is seeking to achieve, perhaps in combination with the new pending load and scenario planning frameworks that we've seen in the draft resolutions. So as I said in my comment earlier, it's perhaps something that we at Cal Advocates will think about further and we'll consider as we see the advice letters coming out in a few weeks. And I thought just one other comment. I mean, I think perhaps part of the drive in the final decision last year and what's required in the IGP process generally is just to ensure that at its heart that I think the different teams within the utilities are talking to each other. So those people working on wildfire mitigation solutions are engaging with those that are working on capacity and load growth. So yeah, that's just two observations that we'll ponder on more as we see the advice letters.
Yes, when?
Yeah, just to respond to that. Yeah, Richard, yeah, appreciate your comment there. And between workshop 1 and workshop 2, it's the way that we understand it, this is all about customer affordability, right? And making sure that the utilities are making prudent decisions in terms of keeping costs down for our customers. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And those prudent decisions, and I think the theme that you're hearing here is those are engineering decisions that we can't automate through some type of formula or some type of automated solution like integrated grid planning process. Irrespective of whether we deploy a integrated grid planning process or not, the decision making about managing uncertain loads and what's cost prudent it's really on the engineers, and I think that's the theme that you're hearing here. And obviously that's a flexible process and a process that will continue to improve, and we'll obviously take any feedback on that. But that's why the focus for this workshop is really on that front end process.
Great, yes, thanks for that.
I don't see any more hands up, so I'll go ahead and proceed to the next steps. Next steps, workshops have concluded. We have 2 workshops, and this is the second workshop. I do want to open to submit questions and comments to the IDER proceeding service list by Tuesday, December 2 for IOUs to consider in their advice letter. So it'll be similar to workshop number 1, but although we don't have a follow-up workshop after this, the questions and comments submitted would still be beneficial for the IOUs and also for ED to consider with the advice letter and then an upcoming resolution to address the advice letters. So the advice letters will be due no later than Monday, December 15. And with 30 advice letters, there will be a protest period. So stakeholders, parties can still make comments and also add their, questions, any other feedback once this advice letters have been submitted. And the tentative timeline for Energy Division to have a resolution after that, likely in Q1 2026. Oops, we don't have lunch since we are ending earlier. Again, thank you everyone for joining in, and thank you for the utilities for presenting their integrated planning plans and looking forward to your advice letters. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, John, for facilitating and hosting, and thank you, Utilities, for your presentations and everyone for your participation.